I'm Rosemary Armeo, and I want to thank you for tuning in to my podcast on the Brink. The origins of this week's chapter are a little convoluted, so bear with me a second and let me explain. I recently went to this political meeting, and it was held in a Methodist church in Troy. And because, unusually enough, I got there early, I began looking over literature in the back of the room. And a little brochure asked this question: Did St. Paul have a female companion on his travels? And it turns out that, yeah, he did. Now, I'm not religious at all, but I was raised religious. My mother told us Bible stories from as early as I can remember it, and I even studied religion for a while in college, but I'd never heard of Thesia. Seems, though, that for 1,000 years in early Christian history, she was about as well known as the Virgin Mary or maybe Mary Magdalene. And if I have the story right, this is a woman who chucked her family, her rich lifestyle, her fiance, and she became a female disciple. She followed Paul around and did some preaching herself. And then she disappears from Christian history. Now, why is that? It seems the church fathers didn't want to talk about a woman who defied society and became well known for it. And they didn't want to talk about the importance of women to their church. And this all got me, doing this research, got me thinking about today, where the rights of women we're seeing are again being trampled, their needs are being played down, and their contributions to society narrow to, like, how many babies can you have? We need more babies, J.D. Vance says. So I don't want this to be a feminist rant or a whiny bunch of complaints, but I've invited two guests to talk tonight about work that they've done on needs of women being ignored, women themselves being played down, their importance to society, and what they think this means, how we can stop it. First up will be Abby Lorch. Abby is, she's a star journalism student at the University of Albany. I've had her for several classes. Her writing is great. She's pretty outspoken. She wants to be a lawyer. She's been accepted into law school, like I say, a star student. And we also have Liz Seegert. Liz and I have known each other for some years. We belong to a journalism group together. She is an independent journalist specializing in women's issues, but especially health and women's health issues later in life. So let's start with Abby. Can you tell us about a story that you wrote that won some prizes at the university, and it involves women?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So my midterm project for my digital publication class was about the issue of period poverty, which is not discussed as much as it should be for how prevalent it is. But period poverty essentially means the inability to access or afford menstrual management materials to properly care for oneself and be sanitary during menstruation. And what I learned in my research for that and conducting interviews is New York is actually the most expensive state in the country to menstruate in, and it costs $16 per period to care for yourself. And in addition to that, even outside of the US, there's other issues like stigma, and in countries, especially in Africa and Asia, they often don't have the resources required to educate about menstrual cycles. So that is an issue that's also occurring abroad. So it's not just a monetary disadvantage, it's really it's a multifaceted issue that can arise from a lack of awareness or a lack of access to supplies that maybe one can afford. But it affects more women across the world than we think.
So Abby, how did you come across this topic?
Um, I think I wanted to do something related to women's health and women's rights. And my first contact that I came across was the Mooncatcher Project, which is a Schenectady-based resource that is attempting to alleviate period poverty at home and abroad. So they have around 7 period pantries in Schenectady and Albany, and then they also create reusable, washable menstrual kits for girls in Africa and Asia to
Wow.
use, so that way so they don't have to keep buying disposable products. And I got a lot of information from them.
And that led you to the project. Do you have recommendations after doing the project on how this issue should be handled? What should New York be doing?
Well, I did speak to someone from Planned Parenthood, and we talked about, not only is this a monetary disadvantage, but this is also an education issue. Even in parts of New York, in some isolated and rural communities, there is not sufficient health infrastructure to allow girls and women to manage their periods. And a lot of the education that they get, because there's no comprehensive sex education mandate in New York State,
Right.
is variable. It can be biased, and it can mislead people in terms of managing their health. So what I think is probably would be a good step forward for us. We've recently mandated free tampons and pads and stuff in public school restrooms, which is a great step forward. And then I think building off of that momentum, it would be really great if we could maybe look at a mandatory sex education requirement just to like standardize things, make sure that girls are not receiving inadequate or inaccurate information about their own bodies just based on the locale where they live.
So I grew up in a house with a mother and four sisters, and I have been for my whole life amazed at the stigma of menstruation. When we were in the sixth grade, Liz, you may remember this, the girls got separated from the boys,
Hmm.
and we were told that we would bleed every month and that this was something we didn't talk about, but we had to manage it. Here's how we're gonna, it's like a big secret, shameful thing. I'm convinced that the boys were taught meanwhile, how to use power tools or how to tell the difference between East and West. But we learned about our bodies and a big secret thing. And there's not even anything unusual about that. Many religions, many cultures stigmatize women, make them separate. They have to be purified after they bleed. And even in 21st century America, men are reluctant to mention it in any way. I once in a newsroom, sorry if I'm talking about myself, but you can tell I'm turned on by this topic. Once in a newsroom, one of my reporters, a male reporter, came up and whispered, it's showing. It's showing. And I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. It was I had blood showing on the back of my skirt. And I said, oh, please grow up. You have a mother and a sister. And yet that was, he thought he was doing it out of kindness. He thought that was what I wanted. How did we get to this point? Why is it a natural function so distasteful to men? Abby, you
I
go
think
ahead. Sorry.
you're good. I think the stigma has always been around, and I think it is a function of patriarchy and just being in a male-centered society. Our entire health system is based on the male sex and male biology. Like until fairly recently, they didn't even use female humans or animals like to test medical treatments and things like that. So we are doing still playing catch up, I think, in terms of women's health being a priority. But yeah, the shame, I think, thankfully, in New York, especially and in the United States compared to the rest of the world, it is a little bit better than it could be. For example, like 77% of girls in India know nothing about their periods until they start bleeding, which is unideal. And women in Afghanistan are told that they'll become infertile if they shower on their periods. So there's a lot of myths that just go around and make it really hard for women to manage
Wow.
their health.
I sort of wish that were true, actually.
Yeah.
So, Liz, I think that Abby set you up pretty well here. You were telling me about when medical researchers use mice, they don't even have lady mice, they're all men.
And they do it for the same reason that they have excluded women from clinical studies until the 1990s. They blame it on hormones, they blame it on metabolism, they blame it on a different brain. And this is all part of this big problem of medical gaslighting. For women, it starts when girls start having their periods, and it continues well past menopause. So it encompasses pretty much a woman's entire health span.
Mhm.
Women, their pain is dismissed, heart attacks are not recognized. They're, if you think back, the Greek word Hysteria is really what doctors have used to describe women. That's why hysteria has become this psychological disorder. It all stems back to how women were thought of, even back in the time of the Greeks. And it's carried through in this medical society, which is still, unfortunately, very male dominated.
Although there are a lot more women physicians than when I first began using doctors in the
Yes.
70s, that has not made a difference that you can see.
It depends on the doctor. The majority of doctors are still male. Majority of certain specialties are male dominated. For example, neurology, surgery. So when you go to certain doctors and you complain, let's say, nerve pain or something along that line, a lot of times you'll be told it's in your head or that it'll just go away. I can relate a story. I mentioned this to you, Rosemary. When I was first going through perimenopause, I had a younger male family practitioner. It was fine for my blood pressure and, keeping me relatively healthy, managing my asthma. But when I started talking to him about these symptoms, he kind of dismissed me with a wave of his hand and said, "Oh, this is all perfectly normal. Get used to it." And wrote me not one, but two prescriptions for antidepressants.
Oh,
We never had a conversation about what perimenopause was, what I should expect, or how else I could manage my symptoms. It reminds me, thinking back to what Abby said about how we were educated about our periods. My mother handed me a brochure, I believe from Kotex, which was the big company back then, and said, "Here, read this." I think I was about 11 years old, so fifth or sixth grade.
right.
Read this and then ask me any questions you might have. And you might remember the black and white film we saw,
I remember it clearly.
with the that otherworld voice kind of clinically explaining what to expect. So this kind of othering, which is really what gaslighting is, has gone on, since our childhoods, but actually for millennia.
Abby, how did you learn about menstruation? Did you have the same experience as we older women? Except
I think in fifth grade, they did something akin to health class where they had the girls go in one room, boys go in another. Again, I don't know what they were taught. Like maybe they just got to like
power
play
tools, I'm
basketball.
telling you.
Yeah. But they showed us a video. They showed us a video that was, to its credit, was very diverse and including all sorts of body types and a wide variety of information about our cycles and things. But I didn't really learn all too much about it aside from that. And I was a swimmer, so when I started, it was like kind of a problem. So it's just like
Hmm.
they don't get into the nitty-gritty of how you actually have to manage it from day to day. They just tell you that this happens, which is like good that I'm not going to be shocked to like wake up in a puddle of blood, but it's like not great that they don't follow through with like this is what you should do.
So I had sons and I talked to them. They knew about it. And they have aunts who are nurses. They always heard about this, maybe too much, maybe sort of like what our executive producer is listening to here on this podcast. Does it hurt men that we segregate this sort of health knowledge into male and female? They're all human bodies. Liz, what do you think? You've studied this for a long time.
Uh, well, having been a parent of a middle schooler at one point in my life, there's a good rationale for separating them out. The girls, I think, will take in information. The boys tend to giggle and make jokes about it. Um, some of it may have to do with maturity. I'm not an expert on adolescent health. So it does make sense from a comfort level where segregation might open up conversation a little bit more. We know there are studies that show that when there are co-ed students, in a classroom, girls tend to be more quiet and boys tend to be the dominant ones. So for something this important, it does on one level make sense, but we are not talking about it as a society. As you mentioned, it's still taboo and whispered about in many circles. And it translates from what happens to 11 and 12-year-old girls all the way up to women being diagnosed with a heart attack because their symptoms are different.
Right, right. The symptoms of heart attack are often spread on the internet, in health classes and brochures, posters on buses, for example. But they're not the same for women. It's that stabbing pain in the heart. Many women don't have that at all, correct? Talk about that a little.
The last statistic I saw was women tend to be underdiagnosed somewhere on the order of 5 times compared to men when they're actually having a heart attack. Women may have some chest pain, but they could also have nausea. They could also have fatigue. They could also have dizziness.
Right,
And they tend to ignore a lot of their symptoms. They might think
right.
it's indigestion because as women, generally, we're so busy focusing on everybody else that we don't think about our own health. And part of the problem is that until recently, a lot of doctors were not trained to recognize the difference in these symptoms. It was a one size fits all approach. And if women didn't come in clutching their chest and saying, "Oh, I feel like I'm dying," well, then maybe it's all in your head. You're just having a bad day. You're overworked. You're tired. You're stressed. We get that a lot as women.
Hmm.
Oh, you're just stressed. You need to relax. Meanwhile, they could die because the symptoms aren't recognized.
We are talking with Abby Lorch, who is a UAlbany student, and with Liz Seegert, who is an independent health researcher and journalist. And we're talking about the disparity in treatment and understanding of health by men and by women, about men and about women. So, why do we women put up with this? Why have we put up with this for so long? I want both of you to answer, but Liz, you go first.
I think it has to do a lot with the power dynamics. Medicine, up until maybe the past 20 years, as you mentioned, was fairly male dominated. Women went into areas like pediatrics, kind of the warm fuzzies. And it's good to see that more and more women are starting to specialize in some of the higher level disciplines. I actually interviewed a couple of female neurologists today, and it was how they approach their patients, I find, is a little bit different than how the male doctors I spoke with talked about their patients. But power dynamic, the instinct to be the smartest guy in the room. Doctors, by their nature, have to have ego. You have somebody's life in your hands. You have to be able to believe you can save it. So there is almost by default some level of ego involved. Um, the hierarchy within, let's say, a hospital or a health system, until maybe the past 10 or 15 years, was also male dominated. Um, it's only maybe in the past 20 years, I'm thinking, there's a large health system on Long Island called Northwell Health. They have a separate institute for women's health. Why is it separate? Because women need different kinds of care. Many of the practitioners working there are women
Mhm.
or physicians that are interested in women's health. But up until, the past couple of decades, it just wasn't a consideration. It wasn't a consideration in a health system, it wasn't a consideration in a hospital, and it wasn't a consideration in medical school, which is, I think, the worst problem.
I was going to ask her that. Abby, I'm going to get you in a second. I haven't forgotten you, but a follow-up question to Liz here on training. We also talked about this, that even with more women in the field, even with women treating women, I remember being very excited when I found my first woman gynecologist. I didn't have to go to a man anymore. There's still an issue because of training. Tell me about that.
For example, just take the area of gynecology. There are thousands, hundreds of thousands of OBGYNs in the United States. They get a lot of training in pregnancy. They get a lot of training in things like endometriosis or polycystic ovary syndrome, some of the downfalls of gynecological issues. Where they don't get their training, occasionally it's an elective, most of the time it's not, are on things like menopause and perimenopause. You
Hmm.
actually have to go and get certified by the Menopause Society and get that additional training because even female doctors who practice the craft for years don't know everything there is to know about that side of women's health.
Hmm. So, Abby, let me switch over to you. Maybe it's not true. Maybe your generation is not taking it anymore. But why do you think women have put up with this? The discrimination, the ignorance, the lack of knowledge, and, just lack of desire to do anything more. Why have we put up with it for this long?
I think the number one reason would probably be because we are socialized to accept more with less help or less relief. Um, I think even if you look at the labor that when men and women do in heterosexual relationships, women are expected to work a full-time job and also do all the domestic labor, whereas men are considered like they look at it as like a, oh, I did this, and it's like the most bare minimum, like I washed the dishes. So, and I think that applies to a lot of areas where women, I think, were raised to be tough, which can be a good thing, but also can lead us to settle for less. Because, like, think about they came up with a study in a recent year that they said some women's period cramps are as painful as heart attacks. And they are not like, there's no menstrual leave, there's no kind of
No.
accommodation in our society for that kind of pain, even though it's debilitating. We're just expected to soldier through it. And I think that is sort of the expectation that women are raised to have of themselves is like we have to be better, we have to do more because that's just how this is. But I think my generation is starting to realize that now that we have a bit of a seat at the table in comparison to recent decades, I think we're starting to push for change in terms of like we are not going to tolerate pain that we do not need to be going through anymore.
Ah, interesting. I think that women are hard on each other too. I was a boss for a long time, and I have to admit, when I'm being honest, that I did look down on and scoff at women who took time off every month, for a period when this was something we all went through, and I never missed time on it. Why did they? That's totally unfair because the level of pain, the cramping, all the conditions are different. And but that's how I was brought up. And that's how we were brought up in the family too. Period. You just kept on going with it. We did that with colds. So you had to have white spots on your tongue before my mother would let you get out of school. So I've carried that down. That kind of supports what you're saying about we just have to put up with it. Um, so Liz, before we move on to my political questions, I want to ask you about your work on with women in perimenopause and with menopause. They have an added burden. It's not just that they're women, it's that they're old, which is another layer of discrimination. Correct?
Oh, ageism is so pervasive in our society. It's subtle, it's accepted. You go into any, CVS and you go to the greeting cards and you see all these, quote unquote, funny cards about getting old. We kind of marginalize older adults generally, and we marginalize older women even more. I remember during the pandemic, particularly when there was a Canadian newscaster who let her hair actually go gray. She stopped dyeing it. And she was fired because she refused to recolor it. Meanwhile, her male co-anchor was very distinguished with his little, gray sideburns and everything was fine there. She sued them and ultimately won her case. But it's just a one example of how older women tend to be kind of ignored. I've done it myself. Um, when I get called sweetie or dear, and I keep looking around like, I want to do that Robert De Niro. Are you talking to me? Because I don't take kindly to that. I'm nobody's sweetie, except maybe my husband on occasion. Um, but it's that combination of being older and being female that makes you
Yes.
almost doubly invisible, and
Right.
even more so in a healthcare setting.
Yeah, oddly, in a healthcare setting where they should be visible because they're the people who are going to be in need, and yet, like you say, they're put down. So, has the Me Too movement made any difference in anything that you've seen? Abby, first, has this made a noticeable difference in the sort of disparity and unequal, unfair treatment that you've documented?
Hmm. I think Me Too definitely was a good step forward in terms of like not only getting rid of the stigma around reporting your experience of sexual harassment and assault, but also even realizing what those things are, because I think a lot of women are assaulted or harassed or abused, and they don't even know it because we are so conditioned to accept these things. So I think things like Me Too, Time's Up for however long that was relevant, are they've been very helpful in bringing exposure to the issue that is often not discussed, especially when people stand to benefit from it not being discussed, such as people in the workplace who might be sexually harassing their female underlings, or whatever the case may be, quid pro quo sexual harassment, perpetrators of that kind of thing. So I think now you'll hear men on the internet complain about like you can't even approach a woman anymore because they're gonna say that you're harassing her. But I honestly I think good, because like now you're thinking about it. Like now you actually don't just do it without a second thought. You actually come to think, even if it's just for, oh, my this woman might come back and ruin my life, which is sort of a selfish reason to do it. It's still a reason not to harass and assault women. So that's good.
Progress of a sort. Liz, how
Yeah.
about you? Have you seen any difference in the kinds of stories you've covered since Me Too? Have women stood up? Has this made us stand up for ourselves?
I think it's opened up the conversation. As Abby was saying, there was a lot of, particularly in our generation, where we were raised to think, well, boys will be boys or men will be men, and that's just the way it is. Um, for people that didn't grow up in a city like New York City, like I did, where this was a constant thing, whether you were walking down the street with construction workers or some rando on the subway. It's you kind of learn from experience how to deal with it, or more likely how to ignore it. And you just kind of go home and feel bad. Now,
Mhm.
at least, there are support groups, there are chat groups. It's opened up doors for conversations, for example, with my son, who's in his 30s and is dating again, and how to treat a young woman he might meet in a bar or social situation, and to not have expectations or feel entitled just because he puts on a pair of pants in the morning.
Mhm.
I was going to say something else, but this is supposed to be a family show. Um, but it's still slow progress. If you look on social media, particularly on places like Threads and Twitter, especially, the entitlement aspect still seems to be there, and men are still like, I don't understand. Why didn't you want to date me again, even though I stood her up the first time? Women are at that point now where they're standing up for themselves, and I think that's a wonderful thing. It's taken
And
us long enough.
and supporting each other too.
Yes.
And I'm watching what's happening now as there's resistance to the Trump administration. The protests are all powered by older women. And I think, and older white women, that's not so fortunate. I think people of color are rightly nervous about putting themselves on the line. Young people do not believe in, because they've never seen it happen, that demonstrations make a difference. But we older women did it in the 70s, and we're out there again. It's just amazing. I began by talking about a political meeting, and I was struck by that again. And the same day we're taping, I was at another meeting. All older white women are powering it. But we don't have to worry about this anymore, because now we have a brand new Secretary of Health who's going to fix everything, right? Liz first.
Uh,
RFK, he's our hope, right? He's going to
oh,
fix it.
I'm really trying hard to keep a straight face here. RFK is perhaps one of the scariest people I can imagine. in terms of what he is doing to our public health infrastructure and to the health of 300 million Americans. His theories are fringe. His rationales are non-existent. He doesn't have any background in medicine or public health, and he cherry picks things from studies that have been debunked decades ago. And as a health journalist, it scares me to no end when he says things like, oh, you don't have to get your child vaccinated against measles, give them apple cider vinegar instead. Um, you know, I don't know where he comes up with this stuff, and I kind of wonder what he's smoking.
Well, specifically about women, he eliminated the Office of Women in Health, I believe.
Yes, he did.
What do you see in that step? Nothing
Um,
good.
Nothing good. I see an attempt to marginalize an entire class of people. I mean, we're 50% of the population. I see an attempt to quote unquote put us in our place because if we don't have the studies and we don't give health professionals the tools to improve women's health, then we're going to be going backwards where women died in childbirth, where old age was something you endured instead of enjoyed. And for everybody in between, it's more of the late diagnosis, the misdiagnosis, the lack of awareness and knowledge on the part of health providers because they won't have the data or the tools or the research to support good medicine.
Mhm. Abby, how about you? You have high hopes for RFK?
Um, no, not quite. I fear what he will do. I think my generation has learned to cope with humor a lot, so I can't like think about RFK Jr. without thinking about like the brain worm and like what is the brain worm telling him to do all this stuff, like misogynistic brain worm, but whatever it is, I think he is an insidious person to have in power. Number one, like Liz said, that he's not at all qualified, as we know, but also to go after the women's health office that when women's health is already so neglected and we're already catching up from decades and decades of just inadequate studies, inadequate medical treatments and options for women, or at least, at the very least, not even comparable to what men have. So I think that is a very telling step backwards to me, and I think that sort of sets the foundation for more draconian things like perhaps a national abortion ban, because now you are laying the foundation of women's health care is not a priority for our administration. Women's health care and women's ability to make decisions with the widest variety of options possible about their own bodies is no longer a priority for the United States.
I should tell our listeners that we did discuss bringing up abortion and reproductive rights as part of this, but decided that's a whole separate show. I mean, my point here, I think, is that the entire field of women's health has been neglected, and it's a bad problem. One last political question, because we're running out of time. I've never loved first ladies. It's a really silly institution, except for one thing, and that has been health. Betty Ford had breast cancer. Suddenly we could talk about boobs and we could talk about cancer out loud. And Mrs. Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy, had problems with premature birth, and we could talk about that for the first time. What does it say now that we have Melania Trump and Mrs. J.D. Vance? Do you see them as avatars for better health for women? Liz first.
Short answer is no. I've never seen them take interest in anything. Mrs. Trump did try to tackle school bullying in the first term. I'm not sure she was terribly successful, and that is an important issue. It's an important issue
Sure.
for especially teenagers and suicide and everything that goes along with that. I don't think Mrs. Vance has done anything, to my knowledge, in the field of health to promote wellness, to promote women, or to just promote health in general.
Right. Yeah,
It's scary.
I made fun of Michelle Obama, but she was right about nutrition and eating healthy,
And
um,
exercise.
and exercise. Absolutely. Abby, what do you think? You like our first and second ladies?
I feel like I don't really see them much, and I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that the wives of the presidents tend to be, with more progressive leaning presidents, they tend to see their wives as partners and not decor. But Republicans, I can't say that about all of them. I think a lot of them, and a lot of the platform that they are using to regress women's rights in this country is depends on the logic of like women should be seen and not heard, women should be secondary to
Right.
men, women should be accessories. And that's sort of how I've always seen Melania Trump, at least, which I know is like misogynistic of me, but that's that's all we ever
Mhm.
get of her. It's
Mhm.
just so I don't see them being like role models or opening new doors to new conversations for young women. I think that their marching orders essentially are probably like sit still, look pretty, decorate the White House and don't look miserable doing it at Christmas. Like,
Yeah, I lied because I said that was the last question, but you reminded me of this new drive that the birth rate is dropping. It's low and dropping, and that's a danger to us all. So get to work, women. Um, Liz, what does this mean for the future of my granddaughter and our children?
Oh, it scares me to death. I keep thinking Margaret Atwood created fiction that's now becoming reality. And as much as I like Elizabeth Moss, I don't want that to become the norm. I have two young granddaughters, and they live in the Northeast, so they will probably be okay on a state level for a while. But it scares me to death that they're going to have fewer rights than we did. And I remember being out in the 70s. My very first Women's March was in Boston. I was a college student, and it was about reproductive rights.
Hmm. Yep.
And that was 50 something years ago. Well, 40 something. I won't age myself that much. Um, and I can't believe we're here again.
Yep. Yep. And Abby, how about you? You're going to forego this law degree and just like raise some babies as is your patriotic duty?
that could be a backup plan. Um, I I think I watched a series called Mrs. America with my mom a while back, and she also remembers like the second wave feminism era of Gloria Steinem and like Roe v. Wade was just overturned. Oh my God, see? It's
Yeah.
like I can't escape it. I'm too Gen Z. But we watched this series and it was essentially about Phyllis Schlafly and the conservative housewives of America who genuinely believed that the woman's role and the essence of womanhood is to be subservient, is to be a housewife, a homemaker, and a mother, and just that's like all you should be. And then there was on the other side there was Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan, which problematic, but whatever. Is they were fighting for women to be able to choose their own life paths, and they said very clearly at the time, like, we don't think that you should be forced to have a career. It's just if you want to have a career because you don't want to be financially trapped in your marriage, then you should be allowed to.
Mhm.
And that, I think that movement, even though the ERA hasn't gotten passed still, and like we just got it in New York State, it's it did its job culturally in terms of teaching us that like we are allowed to make our own choices. We don't have to be pigeonholed into a certain trad wife lifestyle. But now I think there's been a resurgence in proportion to the rightward shift of like all of global politics right now there's just been a resurgence of like traditional values and traditional gender roles. And lots of people are talking about, I just want to be a wife and a mother and like not work, which is like totally fine. But
Right.
then you see men being like, yeah, I want a woman who will just not work and like just be a wife and mother and have bear me many children. It's just like
Almost biblical. It's almost biblical, Abby. I want to thank soon-to-be law student Abby Lorch and freelance health journalist Liz Seegert for a really intriguing show. I end my episodes with a toast. And my toast this chapter is to women who support each other and don't let themselves just deal with it and cope with it. We speak up for ourselves. For doctors who listen, who want to learn about our bodies and treat them accordingly, and even to girl mice who are willing to give their lives for research. Thank you for coming.